Okay, while we are waiting one more minute for other people to join, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining the webinar today. I know that these are kind of crazy times all around the world, but I thank you for taking half an hour to 45 minutes out of your day today to join us for this discussion. With that, um, thank you for joining the webinar. My name is Tim Stewart. I'm with Visual Decisions. And what we're going to talk about today is creating an Industry 4.0 culture. And what I really mean by that is how do you take advantage of these Industry 4.0 technologies by introducing change to your culture that will allow people to be data-driven in their daily activities. So Industry 4.0 itself can create a massive competitive advantage for your company. I like this model from McKinsey that lays out, a number of different value drivers and how much value those drivers can provide. But what I want to emphasize is that technology alone is not enough. I like to use the analogy of a Fitbit. I've been wearing a Fitbit since probably about 2013. In that time, I've gained probably about 20 pounds. It's not that the Fitbit itself is broken. I keep upgrading the Fitbit, hoping it'll automatically help me lose that weight. But so far, it hasn't actually worked. The Fitbit has all kinds of advanced sensors tracking, movement, tracking my heartbeat, everything else. It has the capacity to, let me put in my food intake and all those wonderful things. And, gives me all kinds of pretty charts and graphs that I can take action on. But I haven't taken action on them. I haven't changed my behaviors. And because I haven't changed my behaviors, I haven't accomplished my goals. And continuing to invest in new Fitbits really doesn't make a whole lot of sense for me unless I really commit to making those changes. And it's the same thing on the shop floor. You can invest in these manufacturing 4.0 technologies, but if your people don't fundamentally do something differently tomorrow than they do today, you're really just investing for the sake of investment. So bottom line is that actions have to be taken to really improve the results. They're not going to happen automatically. And to do that, you have to create a culture of data-driven improvement, and then you have to adapt your processes to take advantage of those new capabilities. So the way that we go about that at Visual Decisions is we have basically this 5-step process where in step one, what we're doing is we're mapping out the vision. We're determining how the value is going to drive, the process and so forth. Then we want to get started quickly by leveraging existing investments that the customer has already made. They have data. It's just a question of, how do they take better advantage of that data and start tying that better into the process. And then we can look at filling the capability gaps with these wonderful 4.0 technologies and integrating across different processes to really take advantage of how information can flow. But to do all of that and to take advantage of all that, we have to transform the culture and the process. And so the first big question that we have to ask is, who needs to change? And when we look at that, the focus is usually on the shop floor. It's looking at the operators, what they need to do on a day-to-day basis, how they're going to interact with these systems and so forth. It's the supervisors, how are they going to put information into this? It's maintenance, it's production management and so forth. And absolutely, they have to be involved. You have to get their buy-in. You have to have them adapt to it and so forth. But you can't forget the support teams, the manufacturing engineers, continuous improvement, people in quality, again, those maintenance and facilities people and so forth. Then looking at information technology, there's usually this big barrier between IT people and the operations people, and they usually don't even very much like each other. But that really needs to change in order to take advantage of these technologies that are very IT focused in many cases and highly reliant on IT support. And finally, management really has to embrace and lead this change for it to really be successful. And the ultimate answer is everyone. When you look at changing the culture of the organization, you really need to get everybody involved, get everybody to buy in, and really do things differently tomorrow than they do today. So the next big question is, how much change is actually required? And to answer this, one of the things I love to look at is this quote from Michelangelo. The greater danger for most of us lies not in setting our aim too high and falling short, but in setting our aim too low and achieving our mark. And, one example here is, very quickly, I worked with a company that had 2 injection molding plants. They both started off in kind of the same place. They were dirty. They had, material throughout the facility. They had oil under the machines. It lacked flow. And, their overall OEE, overall equipment effectiveness was probably around 50% each. But over the years, there was a plant manager at one of the 2 facilities that took that starting condition and really changed it. And by the time that I got engaged with these guys, the OEE at that second plant was around 98%, which is probably the best OEE I've ever seen anyplace. And when I talked to him, he said that the single biggest thing, other than adopting lean and going through all those process improvements and so forth, was really just setting the expectations that he wasn't looking for a 1 to 2% improvement every year. He was looking for radical change. And those were the types of expectations that really allowed him to change the outlook of his people and shift the culture. So when it comes to that, though, I understand that initially it's a great idea to go small, to prove out the technology. You want to try the technologies before investing massive amounts of capital to ensure that they perform as expected within your environment. You want to ensure that your people can use the technologies, or at least you want to find out what additional skills your existing staff or new staff needs to have in order to really take advantage of those new capabilities. But once you've established those things, you really want to go big. And there's good reasons for going big as well. I've got a customer where they have 2 plants. And well, they actually have more than 2 plants, but they started off with 2 plants. And in one plant, they looked at very small pilot, and the other plant, they looked at a very small pilot, but the expectations were a little bit different. Plant A said, we're going to wait until we see stark change based on our investment here. And until we see that, we're not going to make any additional investment. The other plant said, we're really just proving out the technology and looking what it's going to take to make it successful. Once we see that, we're going to commit to it. And the first plant is really still at that point where they just have the 1 machine running. And the reason that they've never really gotten that step change is that no one really bought into it because management wasn't committing to it. And so because of that lack of commitment, the information that had to be put in by the operators wasn't getting put in. It wasn't incorporated into the standard work. The supervisors rather weren't incorporating that information into their daily meetings and so forth because it was just 1 machine. So why would they change their entire process around data coming from that when they had manual information coming from everywhere? And so this mismatch between what the scope of the investment was versus what the expectations were really just caused them to gridlock a little bit. The other plant proved out the technology, saw that it worked, would provide what they needed, and had the vision to say, okay, now we're going to go full force with it. And they've actually done fantastic with it. So, if you go to the pool, you're not going to cool off if you just dip your toe in the water. If you really want to cool off, you got to jump in. So what is standing in the way? And, very commonly, we see a reaction to change that looks like this. Someone's going to go hide their head in the sand. And, this is very reminiscent of that plant that I was just talking about, where nobody really wanted to change, and they had a perfectly good excuse not to change because it wasn't really committed to. And so they had this ability to just kind of ignore that it was even there in the first place. Before I get to the stuff on the right, another common reaction to change is, are you kidding me? I've already got all this work to do, and now you're going to dump this on me as well. And for those people, what you have to really be able to do is convince them that by making this change, you'll actually reduce that amount of paperwork behind them and so forth. So the way that we go about this is, first of all, developing a vision and a strategy, making sure that people understand why this change is taking place in the first place. As Cotter says, to develop a sense of urgency within the people and so forth as part of that vision. And once you have that laid out, again, that first step that we look at is leveraging what people already know. So one way to get them invested is to say, we're not going to make you change at first. We're going to allow you to continue using the tools that you're familiar with. We just want you to use them more effectively. We're going to help you really adapt the process to take better advantage of the data that's already there. We want to implement visual controls and utilize those more effectively to drive the Hawthorne effect and other things. Then we're going to create a management operating system that really helps the company get alignment from top to bottom. And lastly, we're going to look at standard work for leaders and how creating the leader standard work really will trickle down through the organization. So let's step back to developing the vision and the strategy then. So the way that we go about that at Visual Decisions is that we look at a top-down and a bottoms-up business case. And with the top-down, what we're doing is we're starting at the level of what are the overall business goals? Are you trying to increase market share? Are you trying to reduce costs, improve quality? What are the key things that are really driving the company at this time? And from those, we're trying to figure out then to break that down into what are the root causes for the current level of performance, or the root causes for blocking enhanced performance in those areas. And once we've been able to drive down into what those root causes are, or at least as root causes we can get to, now what we're trying to do is to tie those specifically to different enablers that come with Industry 4.0. So if it's machine downtime, maybe we're looking at predictive learning models for machinery so that we can see when it's going to go down. And once we put that mapping in place, now we have a project plan of what are the different things that we want to do, why do we want to do them, and what do we expect to get out of them. But then the next step is to, again, look at that culture, look at that training of your people, the skills matrix that you have in place, what are the process changes that need to be made to take advantage of these new capabilities and so forth. And then that finally maps up into what are the expected outcomes and the benefits that we expect to achieve. And once all of this is done, it needs to be communicated very, very thoroughly out to everybody involved. If people don't have a clear idea of where all of this is heading, they're probably not going to jump on board that train, and they're probably right not to. So next step, how do we leverage what people already know? First step I'd like to talk about here is you don't necessarily have to rip and replace all of your existing systems. A lot of the things that we're talking about with Industry 4.0, IoT systems, machine learning, et cetera, can really augment or enhance the systems that you already have in place. You don't have to put in a new ERP system to take advantage of these things. And so how do we actually utilize those more effectively now? Well, what we want to do is really take advantage of the data that's there. And so the first step is to understand what exists today and how can we use that to understand where the performance is falling short, to target improvement opportunities and so forth. And then how can we use it to respond more quickly to the issues that are out on the floor. And then finally, how do we make that more visual and really get that Hawthorne effect in place? For those that don't know the Hawthorne effect, when you see a policeman on the side of the road, you slow down, or at least most people do. And so people behave differently when they know they're being watched. And if you put these visual controls in place out on the shop floor and really guide people as to what is the behavior that's both expected and are they achieving those goals, people will strive to actually do better. So then in terms of using existing data, this screenshot comes from a customer with slightly modified data. And what we were looking at here is we talked to them initially and they said, we have practically nothing. All we have is what was expected to be built and what was actually built on the shop floor in any given day. And so what we did is we took that data and we looked at that at the lowest level we could, which was by department, by product family. And we started putting that together and looking at where are the real improvement opportunities. And even before we got to any, greater level of detail, we were able to see where we really need to focus initially. And so just from here, we were able to go out and drive some improvements on the shop floor. So using those visual controls, I want to speak to this for a minute. From a lean manufacturing background that I come from, we have very much embraced manual data collection and manual data controls and so forth. And manufacturing as a whole has done a fantastic job embracing technology with Industry 4.0, with robots and lasers and all these things that used to be real futuristic when I was back in college. But now we still write this information on whiteboards and then erase it at the end of the day, and then write it on the whiteboard again the next day, and then erase it again, and we lose all of that information. And from a lean perspective, it's done to get the interactivity and the involvement of the team and get their understanding of what are the things that are important to be tracked, and making sure that they're out there physically doing that to make sure that they're paying attention to it and so forth. And that's great, but there's ways to do that with technology where you're not asking people to waste time, doing all this stuff and then just throwing all of that data away. And you can achieve a much higher level of involvement with them doing, much more higher value add activities if you utilize the technology instead of just putting things on whiteboard, because there's very limited expectations of what they can do there. So we want to continue to be data driven. We want to strive for that. This is Industry 4.0 that we're looking at after all, and the whole point of this is to create a more data driven culture. And so as we're looking at what metrics we should be collecting and so forth, and what data we should be collecting, we want to make sure that those align to the process. And whether you look at lean manufacturing or quality or productive maintenance or Six Sigma or any other tool that you're using for operational excellence out on your shop floor, you want to make sure that what the data that you're collecting, how it's tied into these different activities. And so if I'm looking at being able to support 5 whys, well, what is the data that I'm going to want to be able to have to understand why a process is failing? So when I go through those 5 whys, I have data to actually support those. If I'm doing a value stream analysis, I want to be able to understand from the data itself, what is my value add time, what is my non-value add time, and so forth. If I'm doing an FMEA, I should be able to look at my data to understand what are the different failure modes that I'm actually seeing on the shop floor. And so the performance metrics that we collect should really align to these different processes. There's also an opportunity to create a continuous focus on value here. And so as you're looking at capturing information about your assets in detail of when they're running, when they're not running, why they're not running, and so forth, your labor, what they're doing at different times, how the material is flowing through the plant, what you're doing is you're really capturing a complete picture of your real-time variable costs. They're not in the form of cost information when you collect them, it's in the form of time information when you collect it. But you can translate that time information into the cost information by looking at what is the cost of that particular labor, the cost of that machine, and so forth. And now that you have that complete picture of your direct variable costs, that allows you to do all kinds of different analysis and put controls in place and have people focus on what are those activities that really provide value to the organization. Which leads me to the topic of creating an Industry 4.0 management operating system. And lean manufacturing has what's called Hoshin Connery or policy deployment. Other companies look at it as balanced scorecard and so forth, but really the idea here is that you're taking the long-term objectives of the company, you're saying, listing those out, you're saying, what are we trying to achieve this year that support those? What are the short-term initiatives that we're trying to do to support this year's objectives? And then what are the metrics that we're wanting to collect that tie into those initiatives? What are the resources that are required and so forth to be able to do that? And then we're doing this at the top level, then the next level down, then the next level down, next level down, and so forth, to really be able to create that alignment between the different groups. And we absolutely support this from an Industry 4.0 perspective. You have the capability within these software systems to create that alignment, to drive that, and you want to make sure that as you do this, these metrics that you want to collect at every single level are represented in the data so that that can be done automatically instead of people having to do that manually now. And so really in operations, what we're talking about are 6 different categories: safety, quality, delivery, cost, inventory, and manpower. We want to look at that, starting at that strategic level, going all the way down to the operational level, what's happening on the machines. And we want to look at this from, the team leads and associates, at a very broad level, all the way down to the corporate staff. And so we've worked with a number of different organizations to create this COO dashboard. And really, this has metrics across, all 6 of those different categories. And there's several key things to note with this. The first thing is that this is a weekly meeting that the COO runs with his entire staff. And so every single week, all of his direct reports are expected to be able to report against each one of these different metrics. And the way to do that without creating a whole lot of waste within the organization is to collect that data at the source and use it automatically to generate these metrics. So that's one key note, is that it's really driving that alignment. It's going in with the policy deployment that we just talked about earlier. What are those key metrics? Making sure that that's completely aligned. Every single level of person that logs in has their own view. So this is the COO view. But if I'm a plant manager, instead of seeing my different plants here, I would see my plant, but across different weeks. And I would be able to see how my plant is trending on those metrics. If I was down at a line supervisor level, I would see the individual line, how it's trending, as well as probably some change in the metrics based on what they were responsible for and what their scope was. Another key thing is looking at the explanations down here, and not only seeing what was reported from a winning and losing point of view and a raw metric point of view, but also what was the reason for any miss that existed, and what corrective actions are being put in place to address those. And also measuring over time whether those corrective actions are actually having the desired impact. This leads me into the standard work for leaders. And so from that COO dashboard, what I talked about was one of the keys was that was a weekly meeting that everybody participated in, that had clear expectations that were based on the data that was being collected from the shop floor. And then, what were the explanations, what were the, actions and so forth that were associated with that. And this is really one of the absolute keys. It's probably the biggest single lever that you have within the organization to get people to adopt these tools, is that at that COO level, if they're looking at this information and they're looking at the data being generated by these systems on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, and expecting their people to be able to explain what's going on with those misses and so forth, now you're setting up a regular process by which people have to look at these systems. They have to incorporate that into their daily work so that they understand what that is and they can report to their boss of why that particular metric changed in that way. And so by putting this process in place of standard work for leaders, by putting these systems in place where you have that regular checkpoint, that's really going to drive that behavior down through the organization. At a lower level, this comes into what we call a daily accountability process. And if you get down to the shop floor, this is when you run a shift stand-up meeting, how does the supervisor talk to the different people about what they expect from that day? What were the things that happened on the previous shift in the previous 24 hours? How is maintenance getting aligned into that and so forth? And really, what is that checklist of activities that need to take place? And so, at the leadership level, at the COO level, maybe 10, 20% of their time is able to be standard work, and various meetings are taking up the rest of the time. But that level should increase as you go down through the organization to the point where, on the line, at the supervisor level, they're doing most of their day running through these checklists and making sure that they have those accountabilities taken care of. So, closing out this section on the leadership, you have to be the change you wish to see in the world. It's, you know, a standard quote from Gandhi. It's used all over the place, but it's absolutely true. If you want people to embrace this throughout your organization, you really have to embrace it yourself. You have to model that behavior. So what are the other things that we need to be worried about? What else can be done to drive the success? One of the things to focus on is improvement across different time horizons. And so as you're looking at these Industry 4.0 capabilities, some of these things are meant to happen, you know, kind of in real time within the shift, where if the machine goes down, how can I respond to that? How can I keep the machine from going down in the first place? How do I tighten the synchronization between different activities and so forth? And then there are things, you know, at the other end of the scale where you're looking at, you know, what are my trends over weeks or even months? And, you know, what am I doing from a overall improvement perspective to manage that project portfolio so that I'm improving my organization? I'm getting from those 2 injection molding plants, I'm going from that 50% up to that 98%. Next focus is we want to really implement permanent solutions. You know, putting a Band-Aid on the problem really doesn't help you in the long run. It just keeps you up and running for that, you know, very short period of time. So what we have to be able to do is we have to look at actionable metrics. Knowing what my OEE is, my first pass yield, is great. You know, it's a report card that comes home at the end of the semester with your kids, and you can, you know, congratulate them, or you can, you know, ask them what happened. But the report card itself doesn't really get you to why you receive that grade and what you need to do about it. In order to really do that, you have to get to the diagnostic metrics. You have to understand why the performance is what it is. And even beyond that, once you have that diagnostic level mastered, then you can get to the predictive and the prescriptive analytics. What I see is a lot of companies kind of jumping to this machine learning point of view where they're saying, we want to go straight to, you know, that, but they don't even have the diagnostic metrics in place to be able to really understand what the real problems are in the first place, and they just now try to predict them. So it's a step process to get there. And then I'll close this up before I take questions with this quote from a fairly old book now, but good quote. There's an adage that holds true in this discussion. We don't think ourselves into a new way of acting. We act ourselves into a new way of thinking. And what I hope you take away from all of this is that you can't just ask people to, you know, think differently, behave differently, and so forth. You have to do the hard work of analyzing the process, figuring out what change needs to happen, bake that into that overall operating system for the company, and then management really has to take the lead in terms of looking at that data and asking the levels beneath them, you know, what's going on with it and taking action upon it. So with that, I've left time here at the end for questions. There's a box on there for Q&A. If you want to put something in there, please feel free, and I can take any questions that you have at this time. If you would prefer to just follow up with me directly, my email is tim@visualdecisions.com. My phone number is 630-957-8096, and happy to have a discussion with any one of you. At this time, I don't see any questions. So thank you again for attending, and everybody stay safe. Thank you. Bye-bye. Oh, wait, I do have a question. What is your Industry 4.0 project implementation experience? By that, I believe you are meaning which industries have we done this in, and primarily discrete manufacturing, but pretty broad discrete manufacturing, everything from food and beverage to consumer packaged goods to electronics, automotive, quite a bit, aerospace. So pretty broad range of different industries. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all, and look forward to any discussions with you. Please feel free to follow up directly. Thank you very much.